to the Barberini Tapestries, woven monuments of Baroque Rome. I'm Cheryl Harta, the Associate Curator of Academic Programs in Latin American Art, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, the curator of the exhibition, Dr. James Harper. Before I do that, you've noticed we're awfully cozy in here. Our capacity is 90. For those who may need to sit a little bit, we're going to be moving around throughout this room as well as perhaps in the other room a little bit. But for those of you who may need a chair, if you could raise your hand and someone will try to get you one. But we can always fit a few more folks in if we stand. But it'll be about an hour here. I also want to encourage you all to pick up a Barberini Tapestries program brochure. We have some at either entrance. I've got some here. It looks like I'll be bringing maybe a big stack up too. Dr. Harper and the museum have put together an amazing, diverse program selection related to this exhibition of lectures, musical performances, as well as an international symposium, which will be taking place in November. So I encourage you to tell your friends about this once-in-a-lifetime experience to see this show. And we look forward to seeing you at upcoming public programs. Our next speaker is here today, Nancy Hoskins. She'll be giving a lecture on Wednesday at 5:30 downstairs in our Ford lecture hall.
On Coptic tapestries.
On Coptic tapestries, so we'll be going back quite a few centuries. And Dr. James Harper is Associate Professor in the Department of the History of Art and Architecture here at the University of Oregon. And his specialty is Italian art of the 16th and 17th centuries. And he's also been recently appointed director of the University of Oregon's Interdisciplinary Museum Studies program. Before coming to the University of Oregon in 2000, he worked on exhibitions and with collections at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, also the National Gallery of Art in Washington, and the Harvard Art Museums. He received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. And many of you remember his work as a co-curator on Giuseppe Vassi's Rome, which was a very popular exhibition here as well. And Dr. Harper serves on our leadership council at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art, and we're grateful for your service to the institution and for this gorgeous exhibition which transports us into a 17th century Italian palazzo. Please join me in welcoming Dr. James Harper.
Thank you. Thank you, Cheryl, very much for that introduction. And thank you all for being here. I must say, I'm a little taken by surprise by the size of the crowd. I have made a quick adjustment in what we're going to be doing today and how we're going to be doing it, so that we can be more effective with a crowd of this size. I've got to say that Cardinal Francesco Barberini, the mastermind behind this series, the patron who commissioned the series, I think he'd be very, very pleased to see a crowd like this here. And as is so often the case with the Baroque, the bigger the better, right? I just want to reinforce what Cheryl said about the symposium, which I'm very, very excited about. The final details of it have clicked into place. We've got some really tip-top people coming here on November 16th and 17th. Our moderator for the session will be Tom Campbell, who you may have seen in the news. He was until very recently, he was the director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And among tapestry scholars, he's the guy who is probably most renowned for that. So he'll be here, and we've got about 7 or 8 others who will be here. Fred Hammond, who's a brilliant musicologist and extraordinarily charismatic speaker, will be giving the keynote address on Thursday evening, the 16th, and then we'll have a morning session on Friday the 17th, a morning session, and then an afternoon session. If you are not a tapestry specialist, that's okay. If you're not a specialist in Rome in the 17th century, that's okay. The speakers will all be giving new research, but will be giving it in, or at least if they're following my directions, they'll be giving it in a way that is engaging to a what I call an educated general public, a museum-going public, and I think that that's everybody here in this room. So please, you can look up the program online. That might spur further interest. So, with that plug out of the way, I would like to, we're going to spend about an hour together today, and I'm not wearing my watch though, so if somebody could, if it rolls around to 3 and I'm still going, because I could go on all day about the Barberini Tapestries. It's a subject very dear to my heart. But so if it comes around 3, some of you just can gently nudge me and say, wrap it up, Harper, it's time. Originally, I was going to start us out in the room that you passed through to get here, the McKinnon Gallery, which is just outside these doors. And in the McKinnon Gallery, there are a few sort of didactic panels that introduce you to not only the Barberini tapestries that we see around us, the life of Christ, but also to the full production of the Barberini tapestry manufactory, a workshop that was set up in the 1620s and lasted up to 1679. And it's a workshop that produced tapestry for the sole pleasure of its owner, for the sole pleasure of Cardinal Francesco Barberini. And there's a panel on him out there. If you want to, kind of meet the Cardinal later on, you can go and check that out. And Cardinal Barberini, so we've got a panel on the Cardinal, a panel on the weavers, and a panel on the artist, Giovanni Francesco Romanelli, who was a key figure in the development of the high Baroque style in Rome in the mid-17th century. Then there's also a timeline in there that shows you all the different series, the 7 different series. And I want to say something about this manufactory. It was absolutely unique in its time. Most tapestry was produced by, let's call them kind of industrial workshops. And here I'm using industrial in a pre-industrial way, but there was a tapestry industry centered primarily in the Netherlands, what we'd call Flanders, which is mainly modern-day Belgium, and northeastern France. And then there was some production in central France as well. But it's very, very unusual for a private manufactory to exist. These manufactories in Flanders and France took in work. People would send orders in to them. People would order off the list, give me that splendid, Life of Achilles series that I saw at, so-and-so's palace. I want one of those, and they would weave it. Or they would also, and I'm thinking now of Leo X, Pope Leo X, who had Raphael design tapestry cartoons, and then they'd roll those up and send them up to the Netherlands, where the workshop, which happened to be the Peter van Elst workshop, would weave them and then send them back down to the Vatican. That was the normal way to do things. But the Cardinal Francesco Barberini decided he did not want to do things the normal, conventional way. Francesco Barberini was the nephew of the Pope, Pope Urban VIII, and if you know your popes, he's the Pope with the coat of arms with the 3 B's on it. The Pope who's one of the great art popes of history. I mean, if you think about, if I had to name the top 5 art popes, he'd definitely be there, probably top 3 art popes. And Francesco Barberini was the cardinal nephew, or in Italian they say the cardinal nipote, from which we get our word nepotism, right? There was always, every pope pulled in a cardinal nipote to be his kind of sidekick. And Francesco Barberini, he functioned as the kind of prime minister for his uncle, secretary of state, chief of staff, gatekeeper, hatchet man, sounding board, alter ego. He was that guy, and I used to find it much harder to explain until the Trump administration. But it's an almost perfect analogy. The Cardinal Nipote was very much like Jared Kushner, handed portfolio after portfolio, despite the fact that he was only in his early 20s. He was about 25 when his uncle was elected, and he was a clever guy, though, and he took up these portfolios with, for the most part, kind of competence and goodwill. To be a political leader in the 17th century, one had to exert one's leadership in other ways as well, because if you exert your leadership in other ways, then that reflects back on you. It suggests, again, a kind of leaderliness, if that's a word. I guess I'm a professor, I'm allowed to make up words, right? It suggests leaderliness. And so Francesco Barberini decided he was also going to make himself a leader in art, a leader in music, a leader in theater, a leader in literature. And so he developed all of these kind of circles around him. He had an academy that met at his palace, an academy of literate people, what do they call them, letterati in Italian. So what would you call that sort of, literary people? He also had a theater in his palace where he mounted operas by people like Stefano Landi. And for those of you who are familiar with the history of opera, the grand opera, as we know it today, has roots in the house productions at the Palazzo Barberini. So when he decided he wanted to get some tapestry going, it was this extraordinary decision, and very, very expensive, like just staggeringly expensive decision to manufacture his own tapestries, was because he wanted to exert a leaderliness. He wanted to show that his family was bigger and better and more grander as patrons of the arts than all the other leftover papal families in Rome. And remember, Rome, it's like an elective monarchy. Right? The Pope is not only running the church, he's also running a medium-sized country, the Papal States. And there's, every time a pope dies, a new family ascends to the high dignity of being the papal family. And every time a new family rises, they try to, build up as much stuff, as much wealth, as much, grand building projects, and as much art collections as they can, because you never know, your uncle may die any moment, and then you're going to be one of the leftover families. And there's a kind of competition. It's quite extraordinary. I mean, you have families that were at the level of a royal family, and there are dozens of them around. So there's a heated competition in Rome. And I think that helps us understand why Cardinal Francesco Barberini decided to just go for it and have his own weavers. I mentioned that the manufactory was only operative for about 50 years. The moment the Cardinal died, his heirs, who inherited all of the goods and all of the equipment in the workshop and the collections, they shut it down. And somebody asked me recently, why do you think the heirs didn't keep on doing it? I said, well, listen, imagine if you had a crazy uncle. Okay. And Francesco Barberini wasn't crazy, but imagine for a moment, if you will, that you have a crazy uncle who, restores old, like 100-year-old race cars, right? And he's got a whole kind of basement garage, a vast basement garage, and he's got like 40 of these 100-year-old race cars, Rolls Royces and things, and a team of a dozen mechanics all down there working on this thing. You inherit this from your uncle. What do? Do you keep on working on race cars at great expense? No, you shut it down and you sell everything, right? So, I mean, I don't know about you, but that's what I would do. And that is what the heirs did. So we got this sort of flourishing for 50 years of this extraordinary private manufactory. We're looking here all around us at one of the 7 series. The first series was a life of Constantine. The second was a series that showed the various properties of the Barberini, because once you become pope, you make sure to buy entire towns and the castle in the town and the agricultural land around the town, and with the town comes your title, right? They were dukes of Monte Rotondo, they were princes of Palestrina, so they get Monte Rotonda, Palestrina, and then they put their own castles and villas in a sequence with the chateau of the King of France, with the country palace of the King of Spain, and Pratolino, the villa of the Medici Grand Dukes. So you get the idea. They're putting themselves in a sequence with the greatest families in Europe, again, always with an eye to building their own authority. Then we get from the Castelli and the Constantines, there was a series after that of altarpieces for the Sistine Chapel. Okay? And imagine this, they wove a big baldachin, a canopy in tapestry, and that was to be installed in the Sistine Chapel on special occasions. And underneath that canopy, you have the altar, and then where you might have a painted altarpiece in conventional use, they hung a tapestry altarpiece. And there were 4 of these, and my theory is that Francesco Barberini was so excited by this Sistine Chapel series, which had a crucifixion, a resurrection, and annunciation, that he decided, you know, I think I could totally go for this, you know, in my own palace, and I could do a series that's bigger and grander even than that. And so he picked up this idea and asked Romanelli, who had worked on the Sistine Chapel series, asked Romanelli to do a full 12-piece Life of Christ. And that's what is surrounding you right now. It is, I started to say it was a cradle to grave, you know, biography of Jesus, but it's not, because it's Jesus. It starts with the Annunciation, right, before the cradle, and it finishes with the resurrection, you know, after, beyond the grave. As I told you, it was a 12-piece series, and those of you who are really good at counting will have already noted that there are only 10 tapestries hanging in this room. The tapestries, the full series of 12 came to America in the late 1880s. It was sold by a dealer named Charles Mather Folk, a very interesting guy, by the way. But Folk acquired the entire Barberini collection. I think it was something like 270 panels of tapestry. He went to the Prince Barberini, actually. He was asking just for one series that he was very keen on, and the prince said, no, it's not for sale. And he came back, and the prince said, no, it's not for sale. And then finally, the prince said, yeah, you can have it, but you have to buy the entire collection. And so that was the moment when Charles Mather Folk, who fortunately was very, very wealthy, he brought the entire Barberini collection to America and placed these things. You know, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston has got Barberini tapestries. The Hearst Castle in San Simeon has got Barberini tapestries from Charles Mather Folk. But that was the Barberini collection. Not necessarily the Hearst's ones and Isabella Stewart Gardner's were not made at the Barberini Tapestry manufactory. Those were, you know, ones that the Barberini had collected over the years. But where am I going with this is that Folk sold the series to a lady named Elizabeth Coles, who was a supporter of the Episcopal Church in New York City, and she had just made a big donation to the building fund for a new cathedral. And in 1891, when the cathedral, they had their groundbreaking ceremony for building this massive neo-Gothic, splendid building that is so large it still is not completed today. She said to the bishop, I want you to have these tapestries. And so they've been at the cathedral ever since, and the cathedral founded a textile conservation laboratory to care for these and the other textiles in their collection. That textile conservation laboratory has become one of the greatest in the United States. And my collaborator on this exhibition, Marlene Eidelheit, is the director of that textile conservation lab. And if you want to meet her, come to the symposium. She'll be back. She was here to help with installation, or let me say oversee installation, and she will be back for the November 16th and 17th symposium. In 2001, there was a fire at the cathedral. It started in the gift shop, right? And the gift shop occupied some space in the unfinished north transept of the church, and it burned a partition wall that separated the unfinished north transept from the nave and crossing of the church. And on that partition wall were hanging some of the Barberini tapestries. Two of them were damaged irreparably in this. And if you look in the case in the center of the room, you can see a burned fragment of the scene of the Last Supper. And that fragment, you see this kind of ghostly face coming out of the burned edge, and that ghostly face is St. John the Evangelist, who is seated at Jesus' right hand in the crucifixion, rather in the Last Supper. We have some digital interactive stations here. If you're near one, could you raise your hand? There's one here and one there, I think. Raise your hands if you're near one. Okay, later on, we can't possibly all do this at once, but later on, if you want to explore through those stations the 12 panels, we also have high-resolution photographs of the two burned panels, and we also have high-resolution photographs of each of the panels that you see here. And for each, you can click on different details and get a fuller explanation than we could ever give in an hour here together. So that's something, by the way, that you can also access at home if you like. In the brochures that Cheryl has got, which give the programs, there is the web address is there. It's really easy to remember, though. It's barberini.uoregon.edu. So just remember Barberini, uoregon.edu, and you can go home and explore that in your leisure time. So the other tapestries, some were not even hung at the time of the fire. Some were in the cathedral, in the nave, but only got smoke damage, and the smoke damage is reversible. They cleaned them out, and I've got to say, the conservation of the Barberini Life of Christ was about halfway done. They were on a decades-long conservation project funded by the Samuel Kress Foundation. The fire was a big setback to that, clearly, but then they continued and finished the conservation project, and they finished it about a year and a half ago. And so this exhibition marks the completion of this project. And I've got to say, I've known these tapestries for 25 years, and they look better today than I've ever seen them look. And I've got to say also, we did the exhibition first at the cathedral in New York, and we hung them there in these Gothic spaces, these radial chapels, and they looked splendid. They looked terrific, and there was a sort of churchiness to them that I think is fitting for a Life of Christ. But bringing them here and hanging them in this room with the brilliant installation that Kurt Neugebauer and Joey Capadona have dreamed up for it, and the lighting, the professional lighting on them, and the absolute control that you have in a museum setting versus in a cathedral, these are shown to greater advantage here in this room for the 4 months that we have them here, to greater advantage than I've ever seen them before in my life. And I think they're looking as better than they've looked at any time since the 17th century. I think they probably looked at their best in the 17th century. So what's going on in these tapestries? If you look across here, you see the beginning of the story. This is the Annunciation, the moment in which pious, modest, humble Mary is there in her chamber, reading, praying, and much to her surprise, in comes the Archangel Gabriel, sort of swooping in. And I want you to look at Mary and how Romanelli has composed the figure of Mary. She is a very still composition, right? The drapery does not royal very much. Her pose is not full of curves and swayings. It's a very kind of rooted solidity, almost a stolid pose. And then you look at the Archangel Gabriel, who comes swooping into the room on his kind of cushion of clouds. And there you see the drapery, all kind of this kind of nervous, flickering drapery that indicates this sort of motion and activity. And the archangel holds in his own left hand a lily, which is a symbol that we always see with the Virgin Mary, the lily that indicates the Virgin's purity. And then with his other hand, he reaches up, points up towards the sky. And here the sky opens up and you have a blaze of glory shining down from above. And this is the moment in which God's plan for the world, God's plan for human salvation is revealed. And so the light that pours into the room indicates that. The golden light around there, that's all in silk. It's a sort of sheeny, shiny, lively silk, and it, I think it does heavenly light pretty well. So we've got the main narrative scene there, but then if you look beyond it, each of these has got a big frame around it. Okay, and these frames, remember with tapestry, there you get your primitive tapestry where initially people just wove things and put them on the wall to keep themselves warm in the winter. But then you go from primitive tapestry to kind of more figurated tapestry, storytelling tapestry. At a certain point, you get the development of borders. Initially, you'd always have a little border around the side to keep your figurated part of the tapestry from fraying, a little margin all around the sides. But then, by the Baroque period, that margin has expanded to these great big borders. And the borders are about, if you take the square footage of the tapestry, the borders are actually more than half of the square footage of the material overall. And so the borders, what do? Well, first of all, they give a unity to the series. You look and you perceive that this is all of one piece, which you would not perceive so much if you just had a bunch of narrative scenes without borders. So they lend a unity, but they also carry imagery as well. These borders imitate what you call a cassette frame with a cornice along the inside and then the illusion of a flat band that is then decorated on top and then a cornice on the outside. So this is a type of frame that was popular in the Baroque era. And in the band of decoration between the two cornices, you can see the repeated theme of the intertwining laurel branches, right? The laurel branches with these little ribbons tied to them. And the laurel was a favorite motif of the Barberini. The Barberini loved Apollo, right? They considered themselves as, sort of playfully, right? Nobody's going into pagan religion here, right? They consider themselves playfully as the new Apollos. Why Apollo? Because Apollo is the god who's the sponsor of the arts. Apollo is the god of the sun. He's a sort of forcefully positive character. So they're always kind of sounding these Apollonian notes in their own imagery. If you go to the corners, in each corner there is a sort of great fancy shell form which contains a panel of 3 bees with a laurel garland wrapped around them. So you see the laurel a second time, a sort of tightly bound laurel garland. And the 3 bees are the Barberini coat of arms. I mentioned that at the beginning today. And the Barberini, their original family name was Tufani, T-A-F-A-N-I. They were the Tufani from Barberino. And a Tufano, this is kind of a pun, the Tufano is a horsefly. So their original coat of arms had 3 horseflies, and I don't know if you can bear the vulgarity of this, but 3 horseflies and a pair of shears, because they had made their money initially in the Middle Ages in the wool trade, right, shearing sheep. So when Maffeo Barberini, the guy who later became the Pope, when he was on the rise, he was appointed to be ambassador to France. He was Pope Paul V's ambassador to France. And King Henry IV there said, "Barberini, I like you." I'm paraphrasing here. "Barberini, I like you. I grant you as a special favor the upgrade. We can upgrade your horseflies to bees." And the bees And the bees were one of the motifs that the kings of France had in their heraldry as well, going back to Clovis in the early Middle Ages. So the Maffeo Barberini took up the bees. He wrote a letter to his brother in Rome. He said, "Good news, dear Carlo, excellent news. We've got an upgrade. I want you to send a painter around to cover all those horseflies up and repaint them as bees in every chapel, in every part of the palace. Just get it done. And if there are sculpted bees, I want you to send a guy up there with a hammer, knock them off, and then have a stucco worker make bees that look like the original material and just patch those in." So that the bees, they were very proud of their bees, and you see the bees on all Barberini projects. If you look up at the tip top of the frame in the center, you can see a very strange motif here on the Annunciation, and that is 3 bees driving a plow, right? 3 bees driving a plow. And if you look around, you can see it on about 2/3 of the panels. And this is a weird one, but Cardinal Francesco Barberini collected ancient art. He collected, he had ancient sculptures, he had a collection of ancient Roman terracotta lamps, he had just anything from the ancient Romans they loved to get their hands on, because of course the ancient Romans are an authoritative precedent for Roman greatness. So if you can show off all your ancient Roman stuff, it suggests that also you as modern Romans are great too. So in this collection, he had a gem. I think it was an onyx or an agate. Those stones that have kind of stripes of different colors in them. And a gem worker will carve into let's say a brown surface to reveal the creamy white of the next layer. And so there's some very fine ancient Roman work in this. And Francesco Barberini had one of these gems with 3 bees running a plow. And it was done, 1,500 years before his own time, but he loved to show it off. And he said, these 3 bees are just like the 3 bees from my coat of arms. And look, they're running the plow. What's better than running the plow? This is, laying the groundwork for fruitful agriculture and for civilization. And he said, and those 3 bees are like me and my 2 brothers. So there was the Cardinal Barberini. He also had a little brother who was kind of a troublemaker, a roue, Cardinal Antonio Barberini. And then he had another brother who was the Prince of Palestrina. They used him to perpetuate the family. So you had 2 brothers in the church and one running the dynastic side of things. So they're just like us. We are working for the good of Rome, working together in concert, as you would in running a plow, working together for the good of Rome. So that's what you see there. And then in the other cartouches, you've got faith, cradling the cross in the left-hand margin, hope, looking prayerfully towards the sky in the right-hand margin, and then down below at the bottom you see charity, which is the woman with a couple of babies crawling all over her nursing. And those of you who have had babies know that it is the greatest act of charity one can engage in. So that's the sort of general orientation to these. People may have noticed and may start complaining that we haven't hung them in order. Take a look. You've got the Annunciation here right in front of us. To the right is the baptism of Christ, John the Baptist pouring the waters of baptism over Christ's head in the River Jordan. And then in the corner there, you see the Adoration of the Magi, the 3 kings who are deliberately depicted as coming from 3 different continents. You have the European king, the one who is standing with the gold crown on his head. You've got the Asian king who is kneeling and touching the foot of Christ, and he has a sort of Turkish textile on, and that's meant to signal his Asian-ness. And then you have the African king, whose dark skin does the main work there in signifying his Africanness. And this is an interesting idea. This is 3 kings from 3 different continents coming together at the feet of Jesus. And so it expresses this idea of Christian commonwealth. This is a medieval iconography that develops, but the Bible never says anything about 3 kings. They just say Magi. wise men from the East. And so in the Middle Ages, there was an iconography, a sort of symbolic tradition comes up that there are 3 of them and that they come from the 3 different continents. And by the way, those are the only known continents in the Middle Ages, right, for Europeans. They don't know about Antarctica, certainly, or Australia, and they don't know about the Americas. So it's the whole world. I have a feeling if they'd known there were 7 continents, we'd all be singing, "We 7 kings of Orient are." So, but to go back to the point I was making, Annunciation, flash forward to the baptism, flash back to the Adoration of the Magi, flash forward to the Transfiguration, and what are we up to here? Did we screw this up somehow? Why do you think we hung them in this order, which is a kind of scrambling of the narrative order? Any guesses? Date of production. That's a good guess. That's not the answer though. Anybody else?
Maybe that's how they were hung in the palazzo.
Alice has suggested maybe that's how they were hung in the palazzo. That's good thinking also, but that's not the answer either.
To do with material availability?
It has to do with the availability of what?
Materials?
Materials, meaning.
Availability?
No, it's not about material availability.
Tell us. It's getting late.
Will you say it again? Cost. No, they're not arranged according to cost. Yes. Space. That's the answer. Space. All right. And then, in a way, Alice, your answer is right, because how the Baroque decorators worked with tapestry was this: a tapestry series can. These things moved around a lot, right? You would display them in your palace, but you might also loan them, as Cardinal Barberini did, to St. Peter's Basilica for the coronation of a new pope, or to some church for its feast day, which he did routinely. Or he'd lend these sometimes to the university, the Pontifical University, to decorate the hall at the ceremonial defenses of the theses. So these things were always on the move, right? And even within your palace, you might have a room this big, or you might have a room that's half this size. And if you have a room that's half this size and you want it to be decked out with the life of Christ, you don't have to hang all your panels at once, right? We have to think of these as flexible. Tapestry is movable, portable, and flexible. So what you do if you're figuring, okay, my assignment is to decorate such and such a room. Now let me go in and measure the room, and let me figure out what fits best. If you look around, you'll see that all of these tapestries are of different sizes. The narrowest is the Crucifixion. I think that's 12 feet and 3 inches. And the widest is this one behind me, the map of the Holy Land, which is, I think, 19 feet and 8 inches. So, and then between, so that's a 7.5 foot difference, right? And then everything else, there are no 2 that are the same width. They're all the same height, right, for uniformity. But the widths are different, and that's quite deliberate. That's very clever. It's like making a bunch of puzzle pieces that are interchangeable. So we thought, okay, what do we have to do with this room? Well, we've got fire code, so we can't close the doors off, although I argued for that. Because I really like the wraparound effect, and I wanted to make it as tight as possible. But we got fire code and ADA and all that stuff. So what are we left with? We've got a room that's this size. It's got 4 doors. So this wall is divided into 3 rather large sections. So let's take the 3 largest, put them over here, okay? And then we thought, okay, this opposite wall measures, I forget what the exact dimensions of it are, but that we could fit 5 of the less wide ones along this wall, and then 1 down at either end. So then once we had the 5, I think we took the measurements to get us to these 5 here, and then it came down to we had already given up on narrative sequence, and so I just thought, well, what do I like the best? I really like the baptism. That is a great one. I want that opposite the door when people enter, and then let's put the nativity, which I also love, opposite the door. The Annunciation is the beginning of the story, so let's give that the center part of the panel. I hate the crucifixion, and so let's stuff that in the corner, and then what are we left with? The Adoration of the Magi there. Now this is, you're all laughing, but this is the way the Baroque mind thinks, right? So it's an exercise in kind of getting into the heads of these people and figuring out why they did things the way they did. So the result is that you have this kind of regularity, this kind of march of tapestries, and you have this wraparound business, and that is much more important than having things in narrative order. Everybody knows the life of Christ. You know that the crucifixion comes towards the end, right? So it's not necessary to tell that story as so forcefully. But there may also have been moments when this was hung with a perfect narrative order. Okay, let's say hanging it along a parade route, which they sometimes did. A parade route is just one long, kind of sequence, and that would be a great time to do the proper narrative sequence. How are we doing on time? 2:39. Okay, plenty of time. Let's see here. Why don't I just mentioned that I hate the crucifixion. Does anybody want to know why? All right, let me move down here towards the crucifixion. So usually what happened when they were producing these, they did the designs one by one. Romanelli did not do 12 designs and just turn them over, but as each one was nearing completion, he would do the next design, right? And so what happened with the crucifixion was Romanelli had already done two tapestries, and this was in the mid-1640s. He'd done 2 designs, and what happened in the meantime was the Pope died. Okay, so Cardinal Francesco Barberini is still alive, the patron still alive, still very wealthy, but the Pope died, and what happened next was that an enemy of the Barberini became the subsequent Pope. And so there was all sorts of hostility to the Barberini. There was the threat of a trial of the Barberini nephews for embezzlement and misuse of church funds and all of that. And so they slipped out of the palace. The cardinal was dressed as a Franciscan monk, and his brother was dressed, I think, as a barrel maker. And they slipped away to Santa Marinella, and they took a ship for France. And they hung out at the court of the French king for about 2.5 years. And guess who went with them, right? Shortly after the cardinal disappeared from Rome, Giovanni Francesco Romanelli, our artist, our designer here, he went with the cardinal as well. And he was a hit in the French court. They loved him. And the prime minister, Jules Mazarin, had Romanelli fresco his apartment in his palace, and various other people, including the King and Queen of France, had Romanelli paintings for them. It was great for his career. And also, I think Cardinal Barberini appreciated the loyalty of Romanelli. But meanwhile, back in Rome, the tapestry weavers are still slogging away at weaving, and the money is, coming in dribs and drabs, but not that consistently, because there were problems. And so he finished the panel that he had been working on. I think it was the Nativity, actually. Finished that panel. And they decided they just needed to keep going. They couldn't wait for Romanelli to somehow, get a letter to Paris and get Romanelli to send a design. And so Gaspare Rocci, who was the head of the workshop at that time, Gaspare Rocci, he himself is paid for this cartoon. Oh, I don't think I've spoken about cartoons yet. Tapestry weaving is preceded by tapestry design. The painter will do a sketch, he'll get the sketch approved, then he'll work that up into a full-scale painted model, okay? And they call it a cartoon, which has nothing to do with Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck, but it has to do with the word cartone. Carta is paper, and one is the Italian suffix for big. So it's like the big paper. And the cartoni were actually collated paper. You never had a paper that was 15 feet high and 12 feet wide. Instead, they would collate sheets of paper together. And one of the restorers, some of the cartoons actually survive, which is very, very rare. One of the restorers in Rome, restoring one of these cartoons, took it all apart and found that the paper that they used was old music from a lost opera that had been produced in the Barberini Theater. And once it was done, they didn't need all the parts. And old style music, you'd have to copy out all the parts for each of the players. So they had sheafs of leftover paper. So they glued that down and then they painted on it. And then what happens next is the artist prepares the cartoon. And actually, it's just the main narrative scene because they have separate cartoons for the borders, because you can use those over and over and over again. But the main narrative scene is different each time. What happens next is the weavers take that cartoon and they take a big pair of shears and they cut it into strips, right? And the point is, it's not a painting by Romanelli, it's a model to use for the production of tapestry. So they'd cut it into strips of about 16 feet wide and the full length of the thing, and then they load that into the loom, and they just match the colors that they saw on the painter's painted model. So it's like paint by number, only weave by color. And then when they'd finished that 16-inch by 15-foot stretch, they'd roll that off, and then they'd be on to the next 16 inches, and they'd load in another strip of cartoon. So the Romanelli is not around to paint the next cartoon. I'm now departing from how to do it back to the story of why I hate the crucifixion. And so Romanelli is not around. Gaspare Rocci is paid for the production of the cartoon. Now, I don't know whether that means that Rocci, who was a weaver and not a painter, if he just went and painted the cartoon himself, or if he got some painter who was around to do it, but it was not of the quality. What they did was they copied an altarpiece in the Barberini family chapel in the palace of the Palazzo Barberini. It was a great altarpiece by Pietro da Cortona, but somehow there's some stuff lost in translation. And I have a feeling that if Romanelli had copied Pietro da Cortona, it would have had a lot more verve. And what am I talking about here? I mean, you look at the Jesus on the cross. Cortona's Jesus was kind of a Jesus with torsion and kind of a struggling, flexing of the musculature, kind of fighting against the nails. Here, Gaspare Rocci's is just kind of flat. He looks like a wooden puppet Jesus. And then I think that the faces, if you look at the face of John the Evangelist and the face of Mary Magdalene, it's the exact same facial expression again and again and again. And it's a little bit of a dopey-looking facial expression, I think. So here's what happens, right? It's the same weavers, but you can see what happens when the artist differs. And so that's why the crucifixion's in the corner. It's a gloomy subject as well, but a really well-done crucifixion can be very exciting. If you look opposite, here's another case where Romanelli was out of town. This was in 1655, I think, 53 maybe, 53, 54, the mid-50s. And Romanelli had been called back to the court of France. He'd been summoned by the Queen Mother of France, Queen Anne, to come and paint her apartments in the Louvre. And if you go to the Louvre, which is the great museum now in Paris, you can go see these rooms. They're splendid. So Romanelli went to Cardinal Francesco Barberini and said, "The Queen of France has called me. May I go?" And Francesco Barberini said, "Of course you may." But they were a little more organized this time. They had a good painter who was one of Romanelli's students, a guy named Clemente Maggioli, and he did the cartoon for this one. But he copied a altarpiece from the 1580s in nearby church of Santa Maria degli Angeli. And if you look at this, you can see that there's a sort of stillness to these figures in comparison to the others. Look, for instance, to the immediate right, and here you see the agony in the garden, that moment where Jesus is, he's just come from the Last Supper, and he's praying and meditating, and he says to God, "Take this cup from my lips," and God says, "No, this is your cup. This is what's happening. This is your fate." And so there's Jesus praying in the garden, and the angels appear and show him the crown of thorns that is being lowered down by his shoulder, and the column that he will be tied to in Pontius Pilate's palace and beaten with the scourge, that whip that's right next to the column. And then on the other side, you see the cross, and this is just pointing towards the future. Look at that figure of Jesus. It's a sort of, it's got a torsion, it's got a tension, it's got a sort of emotional content that I think corresponds to what we usually think of for the Baroque, this kind of emotionally stimulating kind of art. If you look back to the Christ consigning the keys to St. Peter, you can see it's a sort of quieter set of poses. Does everybody see that? And that, again, it pertains to the difference between Romanelli composing in the modern style here, the modern style of the 1650s, and on the other hand, this kind of throwback to the 1580s. Yes, you're pointing to there's a cluster of apostles in the right who are conversing, but again, it's sort of quiet. Those gestures are very muted and reserved, I think, by comparison to what you see in, I mean, look over here at the shepherds adoring the baby Jesus, and how each body is really doing a lot of work, a lot of expressive work, and that's I think, the distinction. But back to Christ consigning the keys to St. Peter. This is a key moment, right? Jesus loved a good pun, and he said, you are Peter, which is Petros. So Peter, you are Peter, Petros, and you are the rock. Petra is the Greek for rock. So you're Petros and you're the Petra on which I'm going to build my church. Now, who loved the story of the consigning of keys? Because then Christ gives the keys of authority, earthly authority and heavenly authority. That's why there are two keys. Gives those to Peter. Who loved that story? The popes loved that story, because what that tells you is that Jesus singled out Peter, who would later become Bishop of Rome, and the Bishop of Rome kind of morphs into the Pope, the papacy, and to this day, Pope Francis is Bishop of Rome, right? And he is in what the Church is proud of calling an apostolic succession, a sort of sequence that goes all the way back to St. Peter. So if you're in Counter-Reformation Rome, and remember, everybody's going on and on this year about Martin Luther, right? Because it's the 500th anniversary of his 1517 attack against the Roman Catholic authority. So you get the Reformation, and then the Church's response is the Counter-Reformation. And so Counter-Reformation popes loved this narrative, because it says, Protestants, you can talk all you want, flap your mouths all you want, but Christ gave the keys to Peter, and we are Peter's successors. So it's a claim for papal authority. And if you look, if you got to figure, Jesus, when did he die? 33 AD. He probably gave the keys to Peter earlier that year. This is 32 or 33 AD. And look at the architecture. He's standing in a columned portico, great heroic kind of elegant columned portico. That's the kind of stuff you might see in ancient Roman times, in the reign of Tiberius. But does anybody see anything that doesn't belong to ancient Roman times? Wait, what do you see? Yeah, you've got in the extreme upper right corner, yeah, you've got it. It's St. Peter's Basilica up there. St. Peter's Basilica, rebuilt from 1506 forward and consecrated, completed, or declared complete. It wasn't quite complete, but declared complete by Uncle Urban VIII, right? So there it is, St. Peter's Basilica in the background, anachronistically, a modern building, but a modern building that connects the dots between this moment of Christ granting the keys and the contemporary heirs to Peter. So it's a kind of doctrinal statement about the authority of Rome. I'm going to move now down. Somebody tell me what time it is. What time?
2:52.
2:52. The question, while I'm moving, I have a question that how long did it take to make these tapestries? And the answer is on average about 11 months per piece. And they would they would weave them from left to right, or from right to left, but across from end to end. And in the 15 feet and 8 inches, you can seat about half a dozen or maybe 5 weavers elbow to elbow. And so you'd have 5 weavers working on it at a time and just working their way across. So you think about the man hours that are involved in doing something like this. It's quite staggering. The series took a little bit longer than that because work slowed down during the exile of Cardinal Barberini, but then it sped back up and they brought it to completion. So this one is another one of my absolute favorites. Oh, so my favorites, by the way, are the Agony in the Garden, which I love for its verve and its great state of preservation. The colors in the Agony of the Garden are really, really strong. I also love, my favorite is the Baptism of Christ because of the composition. I just think that elegant kind of, those 2 bodies of Jesus and John, which kind of rhyme in some places and then do counterpoint in other places. It's just a marvelous study of, a kind of contrapuntal study of human anatomy. I love that. I also love this one right behind me, which is the Rest on the Flight into Egypt. I love them all, what can I say? But the Rest on the Flight into Egypt. And this is that episode where King Herod has ordered all babies in his realm to be massacred. And the reason is that he has heard that a king is born, and he thinks, not in my realm. He doesn't want to be overthrown. He takes this all quite literally. He thinks it's a king that will supplant him. And so he orders the massacre. It's called, in Christian iconography, they call this the Massacre of the Innocents. The Holy Family, however, receives a tip. There's an angel who comes to Joseph and tells him in a dream to get out and go to Egypt. So this narrative shows them pausing on the road to Egypt. And here's the Virgin Mary sitting underneath this palm tree. She's got the baby. She's nursing the baby during this pause. And Joseph is taking a nap over here because fleeing the Holy Land is tiring. And we get this moment where the angel's back, right? And the angel is stirring him awake again, as if to say, come, we still have work to do this way. And the angel points off into the distance. Now, what happens here? This is interesting. This is not, in the foreground, you've got a sort of regular landscape, and then you get to the edge of the ridge and you see the land fall off, and then somewhere right there it morphs from landscape into map. Okay? It's a kind of bird's eye perspective map. And you can identify here, just about halfway up over the Virgin Mary's head, you see a big body of water that's labeled Mare Rubrum, and that is the Red Sea. And then you can follow, if you go just up beyond my reach, you can see the Nile River winding from the south at the left to the north at the right. And you can see just by the bark of the palm tree a waterfall. That's the cataracts of the Nile, which Romanelli had no idea what they looked like, actually. And those of you who have been to the cataracts of the Nile know they don't look like that. But he just needed to show a waterfall, kind of symbol. And then you've got the Nile, and it goes all the way out to the Mediterranean Sea here. And you see that thing that looks like a croissant, right? That's the city of Alexandria, curled around its harbor. And there's even a little miniature lighthouse there for the famous Lighthouse of Alexandria. And then it's very hard to make out here, but you can do better if you look at the interactive, high-resolution photos that we have in the little station here, or if you look at them online, you can find all of these little tiny details, including the pyramids are there, and it's interesting. It's ancient pharaonic monuments. It's Greek, kind of Hellenistic monuments there, but it's also the places where the Holy Family are reputed to have visited as they moved around. And then there are also Christian sites, Coptic monasteries are labeled on here. So it's a kind of map that crosses time, that all these layers of time are sort of integrated on this. And I like to say that this is not a map of Egypt that the pilgrim would have seen, but it is a map of Egypt in the imagination. And if you look up at the top there, it's labeled Egyptus Sanctificata, sanctified Egypt. This is the parts of Egypt that are either relevant to Christian piety or, like the pyramids, so stunning on their own, in their own right that they are included as well. So this is one of two map tapestries. The other one is the one we started in front of, and that's the map of the Holy Land. I'll speak about that in just a moment. But so you look there, instead of the Barberini bees running the plow, or the sun, which is the other motif. I don't think I spoke about that, but the Barberini, I spoke about the Barberini and Apollo. They also love to put the sun around. But here instead you've got an inscription, Sanctified Egypt, flanked by two putti. Putti is this marvelous word we use in art history. We don't want to call them cupids because they're not pagan, right? Cupid is the son of Venus, and he's a little pagan god of love. But we could also call them angels, I suppose. But the Italians use this word putti, which just means sort of chubby, smudgy baby. And so two putti. And they do a lot of work in Baroque art. I mean, you saw in the Agony in the Garden there, Putti carrying the cross in. You see Putti floating around on the clouds, brandishing this and that. Here they are again. And then at the bottom, many of you won't be able to make this out, but here in the lower cartouche is an allegory of Egypt as this sort of blousy woman sitting on the banks of the River Nile. There's a crocodile right by her leg, and then these two tall, pointy things, which are pyramids. This is how Romanelli figured the pyramids looked. He didn't have it quite right, but that's a kind of conventional thing, and there are even hieroglyphs on them. And then over here to the left and right, you've got in the cartouches these strange architectural views. It was only when writing the book that has come out. Oh, I should give a plug for the book. Go buy the book. It's at the gift store downstairs. It's gorgeously produced, gorgeously illustrated. Does anybody have it here in the room? Do you have it there, Cheryl? No. Okay, no, don't. But when writing the book, I thought, well, you know, nobody's going to write the book on these for at least another 75 years. So I've got to do it right. I've got to answer all the questions. What is this weird little sort of dollhouse-esque, that's another invented word. What is this dollhouse-like building in the cartouche? It's got, you know, it's a sort of very plain, square interior. There's a funky old tree off to the left. And so I just immersed myself in reading about the legends of the Holy Family in Egypt. And I came across something about a tree, and then I started to follow it up. Mataria is the site where there's a tree that is still alive today, right, 2,000 years later, that is believed to be a tree under which they rested and they drank from a spring nearby. So there's a pump wheel to the right there that's pumping water out of the spring, and the tree collapsed, like, you know, I think about 10 years after Romanelli did this. The tree just fell and, you know, died. But there was a sucker that came out of the roots of the tree, and that sucker grew into a tree that you can go visit today. So this, I found not only that there's Mataria, but I also started scouring pilgrims' accounts of the Holy Land, the kind of thing that might be in the Barberini library, and I found it. I found this exact view. And if you go into the other room, you'll see a whole series of images that I've put up under the label Sacred Geography. And it's maps of the Holy Land, it's maps of Holy Egypt, but there are two books in a case. And one of them is this book by a Dominican, Bernardino D'Amico, which Romanelli had at his desk when he was composing these things. So this comes from that book, as does this, which is, this one really stumped me until I found Bernardino D'Amico. I thought, it's got to be in Egypt, but I don't know what it is. Then flipping through Bernardino D'Amico, after I found the Mataria, I found this, which is actually in Jerusalem. It's the church built on top of the house where the Virgin Mary is believed to have grown up. It's called the Church of St. Anne. So there in A Thing of Egypt, there's a reference to Jerusalem. But I guess that's sort of where the Virgin Mary starts and where she ends up before getting back to where she started. So this idea of the map tapestry, the map background, goes over here to just a full-on map tapestry without any narrative at all to it. And this is the map of the Holy Land. Now, people loved to imagine the Holy Land. They're all reading their Bible and thinking, well, you know, where's Nazareth and where's Bethlehem and all that. And again, if you look in the next room, you'll see a series of maps of the Holy Land that I think are relevant in one way or another to this one. A tapestry map, however, is very, very rare. Usually these things are on small scale, on paper. Sometimes you get them frescoed on walls, but I know of no other tapestry map of the Holy Land. I know a few other tapestry maps. Charles V's campaign against Tunis was woven as a tapestry, and a couple others. They're all mentioned in the book. But this is extraordinary, very, very unusual. And here you can actually see the labels of the places much better because they had an embroiderer go over them. The guy's name was Sigismondo Liebenauer. And you can see here, Lower Galilee. Here's Nazareth, and just below it is something that says Domus BV, the house of the Blessed Virgin. And so that's the Virgin Mary's house. Nearby, you've got Mount Hermon here, the place where the Mount Tabor, just below Mount Hermon. Mount Tabor, the place where the Transfiguration is believed to have taken place. And on top of it are 3 tiny chapels, one to Jesus, one to Moses, and one to Elijah, the 3 protagonists of the Transformation. So you can go on and read this. And actually, I think in the digital interactive thing, I've identified, there are 175 of them, and I wasn't going to do all of them. But I think I input about 40 in there to just give people a start. You see the cedars of Lebanon here in the hills, the Mediterranean Sea along the bottom, and then there's the Jordan River going from the Sea of Galilee down to the Dead Sea there. And then floating in the middle of the Dead Sea are the burning cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Nobody knew where they were. They vanished from the face of the earth. And so there's a cartographic tradition of just plopping them in the middle of the Dead Sea because they were known to be near the Dead Sea. So they're up there, and there's 2 other cities, their companion cities, all burning up there. And then right here in the center is Jerusalem. Jerusalem, which is shown here as the ancient city, the city of Jerusalem in Jesus' time. And here the map kind of, we have a jump in scale from the regional map to the city map. The jump in the scale is so that you can read it and find things like the temple, which you see down here on its rectangular Temple Mount at the lower part of the walled city. And then, and only those of you in the front will be able to see this, the rest of you will have to take my word for it. In the lower cartouche is a map of Jerusalem, a perspective view map of Jerusalem as you would find it in the 17th century, as the pilgrim might find it. So you've got ancient Jerusalem and modern Jerusalem. And again, the putti are doing some work here. You've got a little guy with the crown of thorns and a little guy with a spear here. And these are the instruments of the Passion, referring to Christ's death on the cross. And then here you've got a funny little building with a tower on it. This is the edicule that sits in the middle of the Basilica of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Christ is, according to belief, he was buried in a cave. And so they took the cave and they carved all out the hill around it. They carved the hill out and sculpted the rock into a building shape. So you still enter into the cave, but just the hill has been peeled back away from the cave. And so that's in the middle of the Basilica of the Holy Sepulchre. And then here you've got the interior of that very same cave, and you see the tomb of Christ with 6 lamps over it, marking the sacred spot. So these, like in Egypt, you've got these references to the pilgrimage places. Then at the very tip top, there's an inscription that says Terra Sancta, and there are putti to either side. Do you see what they've got in their hands? Yeah, grapes, big, juicy grapes. Grapes which signify, of course, the Holy Eucharist, the blood of Christ, which is transubstantiated into the wine of Holy Communion. So grapes are always a symbol in Christian iconography of Christ's sacrifice, right? And then look what else they've got. Can anybody make it out? Guy on the left has got a chalice in his hand, and he's guzzling this white fluid out of there, right? And then you see the one on the right has got a honeycomb. So what is this a reference to? It's the land of milk and honey. It's the Holy Land, the promised land, the land of milk and honey with its abundance. And I love the little guy just guzzling the milk. He was so greedy, as does the one with the honeycomb, just slurping the honey right out of the honeycomb. And look on that honeycomb, what do you see?
The bees.
Yeah, how many bees? 3 B's. So it is not just the land of milk and honey, but it is a Barberinian land of milk and honey, just as this all is a Barberinian life of Christ. So that's where I think I'll stop and take a few questions if you've got them. Yeah.
Tell me, the room, the color on the walls? Did you choose that?
Okay, the color,
Show these off? My
the
God,
color
they do
on
it.
the walls. If you go up to the, okay, so we've got, the walls go up to a cornice about 18 feet off the ground, and then there's a cove vault that goes up to a sort of golden cornice. The cove vault is all in red, which is the same color it has always been with the Chinese throne room here. And then the color down below, that was picked by Joey Capadona as a sort of, it's meant to set off, to kind of pick up, it's a subtle blue, and it picks up some of the blue, but it also is a kind of disappearing blue. So
The whole room becomes a thing in itself.
yes, and we're in, you also will notice that there's a room within a room. We've moved the walls in a bit to make the room the size of the tapestries. So that blue, I think it's a very clever choice, and it hides, but it also enhances at the same time. And yes?
Can you talk about the dyes used?
The dyes used, okay. They use, there's a fascinating manuscript in the Vatican Library, which from the Barberini archive, where Cardinal Barberini writes to a bunch of his agents. He's got bishops, he's using the church network, he's also got ambassadors, he's using the state network as well. And he writes to all the ones in places where there is known to be weaving or dyeing or anything else pertinent to tapestry. And he's doing his research. He sends them questionnaires. He says, what do people use for green there? What do people use for red? So we actually have, and people would send back samples of dyed thread, and all this correspondence, it's about 120 pages of correspondence, and it's all bound in a volume, and shaggy with all the samples, and it's the most marvelous object. I kind of wanted to get it for this exhibition, but they won't loan it, and so there you have it. But yeah, there's a whole list of what dyes they use. Some are plant dyes. Some are metal dyes, sort of oxide kind of things, and some are earth dyes. But it's a range, but always picked for their lasting properties. Now, these have faded over the years. I think the Christmas tapestries, the Nativity and the Adoration of the Magi, the conservator who I've worked with on this says that those were probably the most exposed. The Agony in the Garden got a lot less action. Well, you can see, compare as you look at the frames, you can see, a sort of control there, and you can see which ones have had more fading and which ones have had less. But the best is if you're ever in the Tapestry Conservation Laboratory, when they have the linings off the back of these, you can just flip the back over and compare back to front. And there, the backs have never seen the light of day. And so you can tell which colors have faded more and which have faded less. Green was known to be the most difficult, but I think they had pretty good greens in this series. Yes?
What would account for the upper left there being so faded versus the upper right here with the bees?
Yeah, the question is you've got different fading here at the top from left and to right. And I don't know if that has to do with maybe using a different batch of dyes. Maybe they ran out of the dyes from one group, and then they just picked up dyes in another group, and they maybe faded at different points, or there might have been, I don't know, there's some water damage. I would have to run that question by the conservator. But if you look, for instance, look at the Virgin Mary's knee over there in the Adoration of the Magi. You can see a couple of patches there, and what happened was these were restored in the 19th century at some point. And the restorer, there were some holes, and the restorer used thread that was the exact same color as the old original threads, but the 19th century dyes were cheaper, crummier dyes, and so the patches have faded. And so you can see there, we had to think about, do you pull all that work out and redo it, or is that work part of the history of the object at this point? And clearly the lab went with the latter interpretation. But yeah, it's always, if you start looking carefully, you can see a lot of these things.
What's the fabric though?
The fabric, the warps, which are the ones that give the structure to the weaving, the warps are all wool, kind of thicker wool, and then the wefts are a thin wool, a finer wool and silk, a mix of wool and silk. In the Barberini manufactory, they also used, for the Constantine series, wool threads that were wound with very, very subtle strips of gold and silver. Imagine that. The silver needs to, the silver tarnishes, so silver is not a good choice, but the gold just looks amazing. Pardon me? Well, that's another question. Yeah, in the you asked about moths. Here in the case in the middle, there's a bag, an ancient linen bag that was found attached to the back of, I think it was the Holy Land tapestry, and that is stuffed with a kind of woolly wadding, and the conservators believe that that may have been soaked in camphor for storage. But yeah, they were definitely attentive to the threat of insects. Yes?
I was just wondering how they moved these things around back in the day.
Well, I mean, I think they were less ginger about it than we are today. Alice's question was, how do they move these things around? And they'd have hooks at the top in the cornice of the rooms where they'd install tapestries, and they just run a line up to the hooks and hoist them up, and you might have little rings sewn to the back about every 18 inches or so, and you just tie a line onto those hooks and hoist them up, and yeah, the way we've got them now, the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, the conservators have attached Velcro to the tops, the back sides of the tops, and then they've Velcroed those to a batten, and then they've hauled the batten up so that the stress on the actual fabric of it is evenly disposed.
They roll them up
Oh yeah, yeah. They'd roll. Getting them from place to place. They'd roll them up and put them on a cart, and they were very, very durable. They, in the 17th century, they were not considered terribly delicate objects. They were kind of workhorse objects. Yeah. Yes, in the back.
I was wondering how they would prevent mildew and all that. The rooms must have been kept quite warm.
Well, I mean, in Rome's not a very mildewy place, but. Yeah, the palaces, how do they prevent mildew? I think a lot of it is in storage, right? And if you store them properly. Come take a look later on at the camphor bag here, or the bag which we believe was probably for camphor. And they had tactics about how to store things properly.
I can't get rid of the stuff here.
Yes.
Were the weavers Italian or?
The question was, were the weavers Italian? So I was just talking on Larry's question about the big shaggy manuscript full of all the cardinals' research. One of the things he understood through his research was that the best weavers were Flemish. So he got himself a Flemish weaver to train an entire workshop, some of whom were Italians, some of whom were French imports, and some of whom were Flemish imports. The guy's name, this is great, the guy's name was Jacob van den Vliet, a good Dutchy, Netherlandish name. Jacob van den Vliet moved to Rome, and he changed his name. He Italianized it, and he became Giacomo della Riviera. And I think that sounds better, don't you? And he had, if you look at the lower right-hand corner of all of these panels but one, you will find a signature. And let me see. Here it is, right here. It says IAC. For Jacopo, the J and the I are the same in Latin epigraphy. So Jac, D-L, de la, and then Riv, R-I-V. And funny thing, Giacomo della Riviera died just about a year or two before this series was started. His son-in-law, Gaspare Rocci, one of these Italian weavers who he had trained, and Gaspare Rocci actually married Giacomo della Riviera's daughter, Caterina. Gaspare Rocci continued signing his father-in-law's name. It became this sort of workshop mark. And then over the course of this, weaving of this, over the 12 or 13 years this was on the looms, Gaspare Rocci died and was succeeded by his wife, Caterina della Riviera. And then when she died, she was succeeded by her younger sister, Maria Maddalena della Riviera. And let me say that you're probably accustomed to this kind of 19th and 20th century talk about how weaving is, quote, women's work. In the 17th century, it was not at all. This was major kind of entrepreneurial, quasi-industrial sort of, activity, and it is very, very unusual that we had 2 women in succession running the Barberini Tapestry workshop. And interesting to note that when Giacomo died, it was his son-in-law who took over first, and then Caterina, and then Maria Maddalena. So long answer to a short question, but thank you for that. And then I'll take one more. Let me see.
Well, you answered 2 of my 3 questions. So,
Good.
yes. So again, the upper right and left corners, they're on the right side, there's a squared off wings on the B's, and the rounded wings and the B's on the left side.
Let me see. I'm going to have to step back and take a look.
That one shows better.
Yeah.
It looks like it's on all the tapestries.
Well, I think, okay, I'm not, I agree with you that there it is, but I'm not going to read anything into it. I'm going to say that they had cartoons, several different cartoons, one for, I think one for each corner, because the orientation of each is different, right? And or maybe they just had 2. I'll have to parse that with in a quiet moment. But they had either 2 or 4 cartoons, which they'd then flip and use for top and bottom. But there's probably just a variation from one to the other, and a variation that the workshop probably did not even notice. And it might have been that there were 2 different assistants of Romanelli, each working on them simultaneously, and one just painted some square wings and one painted some round wings, and away they went. That's the best answer I can give you.
Okay.
All right. Okay, a really short question, yes.
Would they have woven it from the front or the back?
Okay, when you're doing bas-relief weaving, and I invite you afterwards to go into the other room, and you'll see a few prints that illustrate bas-relief weaving at the Gobelin. I wish somebody had done prints that illustrate bas-relief weaving at the Barberini manufactory, but they didn't. But if you look at the Gobelin prints that are just hanging on the wall right behind here, you'll see exactly how they did it. And there were the warps, and they wove the weft into the warps from behind. So that if you look, and in the book there's an illustration of the back side of one of these, and you can see that sort of woolly, shaggy, messy, kind of the workspace where the knots are visible and nobody's bothered to snip off the trailing ends. And so they would weave on the back, and then it was only when the thing was done that they'd be able to pull it up and see, and they could probably see the fronts in bits and pieces, but then finally, imagine you work on this thing for a year, and then it's pulled up and exposed, and you see that you were right to trust yourself, and it looks gorgeous.
And then the wine is poured.
Yes, that's right, that's right.
They were made for
Well-
hanging only, right? They were never walked on?
Oh, no, never walked on. They were made for hanging only, that's right.
I thought they might have been in castles or something, but
Well,
only churches.
these moved around quite a lot, but mainly in Barberini palaces, in Roman churches, and in Roman institutions. They didn't really leave Rome. They never took these out to the countryside. There's a whole bunch of research. The Barberini had a storeroom with a guy running the storeroom. He was called the guardarobiere, and he would sign these things out when people would borrow them. And I got hold of, in the Vatican archives, the book of what they call the entrate and uscite of the guardaroba, the things that go out and the things that come back in. And you can see exactly what they loaned to whom, and then how they counted all the pieces when they came back. And there was one guy who returned things with water damage, and he was, in the margin it says, never lend to this guy again. He's off the list. So yeah, but always on the walls. Now, thank you very much, everybody, for being here. I'll stick around if you want to talk.